You're listening to Coding Blocks, episode 31. Subscribe to us and leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, and more using your favorite podcast app.
Visit us at codingblocks.net where you can find show notes, examples, discussion, and more.
Send your feedback, questions, and rants to comments at codingblocks.net. Follow us on Twitter at codingblocks or on Facebook. Or head to www.codingblocks.net and you can find all our social links at the top of the page. And with that, welcome to Coding Blocks. I'm Alan Underwood.
I'm Joe Zach.
And I'm Michael Outlaw. And with that, let's get into it. So it's been an interesting few weeks since the last one. Went to some interesting meetups. Alan actually went with me on one of them. Went to the Meteor in gaming. What did you think of that?
Actually, that one was really cool. I mean, if you haven't seen Meteor.js in action, they kind of took it to the next level by having like what would you call it? Like what were those old diamond games? I can't. Where you flip the
like a Bejeweled game,
yeah.
Candy Crush.
Yeah, so they took like a Bejeweled type game and created one in what I think he said 2 weeks. It was
2 weeks. But here was the thing that for me though that was the bigger takeaway was just Meteor.
Yeah.
If you're not already playing around with Meteor.js, like this totally got me. Like I wish I had more time to focus on it because there's some other libraries I've been spending some time on, but Meteor is definitely on my list of things to do. So this is the reason why when you ask me like, "Hey, Outlaw, how are you doing on your resolutions there? How's that Ruby coming along?" Right? This is why I still haven't got it because there's so many other frameworks and libraries out there that are more interesting to me.
Yeah, he's got ADD. We all do. We're developers. It happens, right?
Yeah, but Meteor is on my list. It's basically like if you haven't seen this thing yet, it's like. How would you describe it? I would describe it as like maybe an NPM for a JavaScript framework. Like, is that fair?
Well,
that's quite fair.
It's compared. People have compared it to what Rails is for Ruby. It is what Java or what? Yeah, it's like the Rails for Ruby. It's that to Node. And so here's the cool part. Like probably what blew Outlaw away and what blew me away when I first started playing with it is what's called DDP, their distributed data protocol, and basically, if you've heard of, I can never remember the name of this thing, Signal R. If you've ever heard of Signal R and all the real-time collaboration type stuff, this is the same type thing. Like you can do pub-sub type things and, your app updates and everybody connected to it gets an update. So, and it's so easy to do. I mean...
That wasn't even the exciting part. I know that pub-sub
really?
was like the most thing. No, it was just the fact that like I said, having all the modules out there, I don't know. There's still, I'm by no means a Meteor expert, but there's still a lot that I want to dig into. But it was that part that, like, when we were talking later about like the login modules and like automatically, be able to use your social, plugins for OAuth and things like that. It was that kind of thing that I thought was just awesome.
Yeah, you could prototype an entire app in an incredibly short period of time. So it was definitely a cool meetup. They covered a lot of neat stuff there, so that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and then there was the intro to Flux meetup too, which was really interesting too. Because so React has definitely been one of the things that I've been focusing more time on here lately in my infinite free time, and Flux is the architecture that they're using that Facebook is using to handle the M and the C portion of MVC maybe, although they really say that Flux is not an MVC pattern, so that's kind of confusing. I don't know. What are your opinions on that?
I actually have not looked into Flux at all to this point. I did, but along those lines...
Well, you've blinked and there's already like 24 derivatives of it. So.
You said that. The guy said that at the end of it, right?
It was ridiculous. Like, I mean, it's not an old framework by any stretch, but I mean, it's not... It also didn't just come out last month either, in all fairness. But yeah, the guy that was giving the presentation, at the end of the presentation, mentioned that there was already, he listed at least a dozen different derivatives of it, and those were just the ones that he's actually taken the time to look at. There was more that he didn't bother.
Well, along that note, so I say that I haven't looked into it. Unfortunately, I kind of have, but it was confusing. So I just recently bought WebStorm, and In there, they have a template starter thing for React, but it comes bundled with Flux. And I was looking through the code, and I couldn't figure out how any of it wired up. So I'm actually going to have to go out and do some tutorials to kind of pick up the pieces there. But I am on the WebStorm bandwagon because for $50, it's pretty good.
This is kind of funny. I was going to bring this up as a joke because, like what he's not telling you is I totally convinced him on that purchase, though, because he was kind of like on the fence about like, which way to go. And, I've mentioned I'm such a huge fan of JetBrains products before, right? There might have been one or two times that I've mentioned ReSharper. So if you would like to have that, but in a lighter weight client where you could, use some of that functionality on your JavaScript, then WebStorm can do awesome things for you.
Well, but you want to know what actually sold me on it besides just you? I mean, because you were a strong contributor to that. I was also looking at IntelliJ, which is, I think $250 for a personal license. And I was almost willing to do that simply because it had a database plugin, because I really want to have something to be able to play with Postgres well. And if you've ever used pgadmin 3, I hate being the person who just says something stinks, especially when it's free, but I cannot stand that piece of software. But WebStorm does have a database plugin, and I haven't tried it yet, but I was like, you know what? I'll give this a shot. If it's even halfway decent, it'll be as good as pgadmin. And so for $50, I have a great JavaScript / framework editor type thing, and I can get some additional functionality. So that's, for $50, I paid more for Sublime,
Yeah. Well, I also feel like it's important to note too, because the one thing that your mileage may vary, but for my personal taste, the one thing that does bug me about both IntelliJ and WebStorm is the color palette. To me, it's just not visually pleasing to the eye, and I'm such a huge fan of the dark theme in Visual Studio. So I've mentioned this before. If you like the JetBrains IDEs, you should go to ideacolorthemes.org, and they have several themes that other people have created that you can view, and these themes work for WebStorm and IntelliJ, and there's some awesome themes out there that you can change. You can play around with the colors, because both IntelliJ and WebStorm have the Darkula theme, I believe is what they call it, but that doesn't quite compare, isn't quite as nice as Visual Studio's. But I found some in there that, after playing around with some of the ones that were in there, I found one that was really close enough for me, and then with some of my own customizations on top of it, then it got better. So.
Yeah, I also wanted to mention Navicat is really nice. They have a Postgres product. I've used their MySQL product before, and I think for iOS it starts at $19.99, but you kind of have to buy features, so it ends up being kind of costly if you want to get everything. But
wait, you said iOS?
Yep. It might be iOS. I meant to say Mac, but
okay.
Like the Windows is like $149, so it's pricey. But
I think you mean
good.
OS 10.
So that's kind of what did it to me. I was like,
there is no OS X. It's OS 10.
Okay, OS 10.
Oh, pardon me.
Yeah, whatever. Anyways, so that was the one reason why I didn't grab Navicat, because they don't even give you a trial, if I remember right. Maybe they do, but I was like, $150, man. Like, I can get a full-blown version of SQL Server Developer Edition for $50, right? Like, it just killed me that I was paying that much for a free quote-unquote database.
And actually, I was right. It was iOS. There is a Mac version as well, which starts at $149. But yeah, iOS is only $19.99. So if you don't mind doing it on your phone, then go for it.
Well, I guess if you hooked up a Bluetooth keyboard to your iPad, that wouldn't be absolutely terrible. I don't know.
Only mostly terrible.
Yeah, I agree. Well, maybe with the iPad Pro coming out, where it's going to be a bigger screen, it wouldn't be so horrible.
They're rumored.
It's going to happen, man.
Rumored.
It's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, whatever.
All right, so I guess moving on from there, what we got next?
Yeah, so and I finally remembered to go ahead and sign up for Connect.js. I don't know if you have or have not, but if you are in the Atlanta area or are looking for an excuse to come to the Atlanta area, Connect.js is happening October 16th and 17th. You can find out more information at connect-js.com. I'm looking forward to that one. There's going to be a lot of good speeches there, or topics there.
I meant to sign up, and I completely forgot, which means I'd have to pay more if I do it now. So yeah, we'll see. It's probably not that much more.
Yeah.
So I wanted to mention something else. So probably most everybody who listens to this podcast, because it has .NET in the title, probably also listens to this other one, .NET Rocks. Well,
What?
Yeah,
I've heard of that.
I thought you were going to say, I thought you were talking about the other podcast when you were saying that they listen to it because it has .NET. And I was like, wait a minute, they probably listen to it because they like rocks.
It's the other podcast. If you get that reference, cool.
All right.
So, well, I was listening to the latest episode, and they had Julie Lerman on, and she is absolutely amazing. If you are on, or if you've ever been on Pluralsight, she does almost all the top-rated Entity Framework learning videos, and she is absolutely phenomenal. Like, just go check her out. Now, here's the crazy part. For whatever reason, she decided she wanted to jump in and start messing with Aurelia. And so she's talking about it on there, and it was interesting hearing somebody who is so well known for producing like super quality content and basically feels like she knows everything, right? And so kind of the reason I want to bring this up
She's like the Entity Framework goddess.
She is, absolutely. She was like a fish out of water doing this stuff. And it was kind of cool to hear somebody, because I mean, we all deal with things daily that you're an expert at, or if you're getting into things. I just wanted to bring this up because people say, how do you learn things? She actually goes off and has a long blurb where she's talking about how, the very first thing she did is she would go and download these things and then start listening to or going through the tutorials to build the things, because, that's how you got the basis of what was going on. And then the next thing she'd do is she would run the debugger as she was stepping through this stuff so that she could see how it bounced around in the framework and how it hit all the things.
I feel like you're trying to skip ahead to my episode 30 survey results.
Oh, really? Oh, I forgot about that. Right. Oh, yeah. So anyways,
Don't go cheating, Joe.
I did want to say though, I mean, the episode is about, her messing with Aurelia, but there are so many gems in there that she drops. And so it's okay for people that aren't comfortable with a particular technology to go pick it up. Like, I mean, she like he said, she's the goddess of Entity Framework. And it's really cool to hear somebody who is respected as well as she is to say, I hit so many walls trying to do this, but, it was her approach to doing it that I thought was really important. So I wanted to bring that up. It was a great episode. I would definitely go give that a listen, and we'll have a link in the show notes.
Speaking of links, do you know of any new places where you might be able to find out or listen to us?
Oh,
SoundCloud.
Yeah.
What?
So we had a request. I don't even remember who did it at this point, but we had somebody complain that we weren't on SoundCloud. So because we want to make this as easy as possible for you guys to share to people and make it available everywhere, we have basically got us a SoundCloud account now. So you can head to www.soundcloud.com/codingblocks. You can go to our site at www.codingblocks.net and just go to the top of the page and click the link. Whatever you want to do. The point is, we are now on SoundCloud. You can download on iOS, Android. You can listen directly on the web. And please do, subscribe to us there now, if that's your thing, and, share. So, I am slowly catching up the backlog because it takes a lot of time to port everything over from, one host to another, but we are now on SoundCloud.
Are you like sneaker netting it to them, or?
Man, it is manual labor.
Yeah. The app looks really pretty too. It kind of shows the artwork in a cool way. So if you're listening to the episodes, it just looks nice.
Yeah, I've been impressed with it, and not everybody's on it, but it's one of those things. Like, somebody asked for it, and because we can, we were like, you know what, we'll go ahead and make that happen. So, we're excited about it. Well, hopefully you guys are as well. So, the next thing I want to bring up, and only Joe has responded to this email, and so I guess we're just going to respond to it publicly here, was we got an email from Stephen Lopes asking about global variables and when they're appropriate to use. And he actually, in his own email, he went into it to an extent that I thought he did a pretty good job explaining how he would avoid doing a truly global variable. So, I'll chime in on my thoughts here. So what he was talking about doing was, I know that it's not a good idea to have a global variable, and people who don't know why, really the simple answer is you can't control it, right? If you have a global variable that everything can touch, then you have no idea what actually touched it, right? Like, unless you put in just crazy amounts of logging, and that's just a really bad way of going about doing things. So typically what you want to do is, if you do have global, type variables that you need to maintain or whatever, he brought up Singleton. And of course, Outlaw's over there just waiting to scream out at the top of his lungs to the world that yes, this is how you do it. That is a great way to do it. If you
it's a one way. Let's say it's one way.
It's a great way. So you can either have that, or you can have some sort of object that persists in memory elsewhere that things have access to. But essentially, you do want to control it. You don't want to have just a variable out there. You want to control how it gets set, how it gets,
Did you already say the example that he gave?
No, I didn't.
So for everyone else's edification, he says that, let's assume that we have some sensor that reads the ambient temperature of the room, right? So there's only the one sensor, right? So that's where, my giddiness about the Singleton kind of came up. But, jokingly, because I know that that's become a thing now, but
we have images to back it up.
Yeah. So that's where it was coming from, was that, there's this one thing, right? So how do I share that thing without it being global, right?
Yeah. And Joe, what was it? You did respond to him, and what was your take?
Yeah, I did. And what I was kind of thinking along the lines is basically, globals are bad. Okay, if this is an interview, that's your answer. But, they're bad because they break encapsulation. It's not as future-proof. And you can get around some of the problems of having all this plumbing code with dependency injection, which is like its whole another big nightmare. But what I finally ended up responding with that was actually... just go ahead and do it as a global, because if this is something small and you have things to get done, the code's worst enemy is more code. So if you've got this nice little project that's doing its thing and it's working and it's using a global, then so what? You're done. It's wonderful. And if you need to make changes in the future, you can address it then.
Joe is cray-cray. He's off his rocker.
This is not the right answer, but it totally is.
I don't like that advice, Joe.
Like, did you cringe a little bit when you heard that answer coming from Joe? Like, of all people,
I know, right? No, I would totally
if I did this, it'd be like 5 interfaces, and it'd be like 2 months later, I'd stop talking about it, and 3 months later, I'd officially tell you that I stopped.
So I guess here's my take. I completely agree. Overcomplicating code from the get will stop you from coding anything useful, right? Like, you're 300 interfaces in it, and you haven't even gotten your hello world thing working yet.
There is something to be said about getting the minimal viable product out there, right?
But I feel like even if you decided at worst case scenario to go Singleton, at least then you have controlled the ins and outs.
Whoa. Why are you calling it the worst case?
Okay, sorry.
I don't... Global was the worst case.
Global was the worst.
Singleton actually wasn't the worst case, because then you could add some thread safety around usage of it.
It's fairly... Actually, I like the implementation of Singleton there. Anything that's going to have a global counter or monitor or something, but I do not like the global. You just make it global. I can't stand that.
Yeah,
Joe,
that
hurts
made me
a little.
Crazy, Joe. I was like, what? You said global?
Well, while you guys are trying to figure out what to name your silly little Singleton, I'm done and partying at the beach. So
dude,
whatever.
No, that's simple. I just call it the global Singleton.
And then all of a sudden, you have two things like changing the temperature of this, and you can't figure out why it's 10 degrees off.
Or better yet,
you
I
just
might just
scroll down a little bit.
Maybe I should just call it the global helper util Singleton
library.
Maybe that's a good rule of thumb. If your code is small enough to exist sanely in one file, then it can be a global.
Okay.
But once you start talking multiple files, then it's too big.
How long is that file?
500 lines.
we have these stipulations. So
Yep.
yeah, at any rate, hopefully that helps out a little bit. It was a great question, and it sounded like he had already thought about it quite a bit, but we wanted to address it here because I think it's a good one.
Yep. Also, another email we got, Wesley Backer sent us a really nice link to some design patterns that he had written up and had some really good examples of some ones that we talked about, and he had some really nice examples, but the link is broken for me right now, but I'm going to go ahead and mention it just in case it's working by the time we post the show notes, but you guys should go check it out if you're interested in design patterns. And also, he mentioned view state as an example of a memento pattern, which was a good example we hadn't thought of. And I actually got a lot of flack for hating on the memento pattern. So since the airing of that episode, I've gotten quite a few people mentioning to me good uses of memento patterns. So I'm sorry if I was down on them. Please stop yelling at me.
Are you back up now?
So
yeah, mementos are cool. I give up.
So, Alan, are you sure? Because it sounds like he's just doing it reluctantly.
Yeah,
he's suddenly on board with the memento pattern, but not because he chose to be.
Yeah, I don't know that we can believe this.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna say I'm cool with it, and then make little remarks about it for the rest of my life.
Kind of like you do with JavaScript, right?
Exactly like JavaScript.
Yeah, that's going to be great for this
Wow.
particular show.
Ouch. That's crazy. Oh, and by the way, guys, I see your tweets, so when you tweet these crazy tweets about, when I don't like that we're going to tweet what we're going to do before we do it, and you're not going to tell me, I see those. So in case you don't know what we're talking about, Alan last week was tweeting an email yeah, no, we're totally going to email. Meanwhile, he could barely talk at all. And I was like, Alan, are you crazy? Why do you think we're going to record?
So yeah, I was planning on recording last Wednesday, but Outlaw nicely pointed out that I was swallowing a gallon of snot about every 5 seconds.
Wow, thanks I wasn't going to bother to mention that part.
So
that was unnecessary.
While I technically could speak, it was going to be
it was brutal for me to listen to.
It was going to be a tasty sounding episode. So we decided to skip
that's a crazy adjective to throw in there.
So yeah, while I may not sound 100% now, at least I'm not constantly, swallowing phlegm. So
this is so much better than last week.
This is sexy Alan voice.
Good. Yeah, I want to mention the reviews, but first I just realized we never actually mentioned what the topic was, but I promise we're getting to one.
Maybe.
Okay,
maybe.
Get it? Haha. All right,
nice.
So,
I promise at some point we will discuss what it's about.
Yes.
Yep, but not yet. So first, big thanks to all the reviews we got. We got a ton of reviews this time, so we really appreciate it.
You guys have been awesome.
Yeah,
Yep.
both on iTunes and Stitchers. Fantastic.
Yep. So I'm gonna blast through these because they're awesome. JMM Zen, OJ Hawkins, J Canero, Beach and Bites, GBD77RC, Sparkster 314159, holla, Mike Levery. We've got Servant 14, Thread Sleep, and Aditya's Rikumar.
Yeah.
So I apologize for butchering all of this.
You guys are awesome. That was awesome to see that we got that many new reviews that came in between the last episode and this one. But hey, for all you people on Reddit, we see you too. All right. So I happen to notice that we haven't discussed this before, but there are some. We've been getting some love on Reddit, so I wanted to give a shout out to Death Row, Tom5171, James XV7, and special one out to Coderhawk and Jesse 2014 for some of the love we've gotten on Reddit. Big thanks to that. We really appreciate it, guys. And then also, we haven't forgotten about you, Stack Overflow, specifically you, Andy Joyner. Yeah, you. We got some love there too, and we greatly appreciate it. So thanks for spreading the word. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah, and he's been with us since near the beginning, which is just awesome. So, yeah, huge thanks for that.
So that takes me to what I mentioned, kind of hinted at a little bit before, which was, we had the survey in episode 30. And you guys haven't cheated, right? I gotta see Joe's face, make sure that guy hasn't been cheating here.
I have not cheated on the survey today.
I have
Notice
not
how
looked.
he's like hiding behind the pop filter there. Like, I'm not so sure that counts. Okay, so the question was, are you better off spending more time learning specific frameworks or the underlying technologies?
I think Outlaw lost.
The first answer was, well, frameworks I'll dive into the underlying as needed. Or the second answer, the underlying technologies. You got to walk before you can run.
Blah.
Now,
I feel like you led the question.
last episode, I think I was the only one that was saying, no, you got to start with the underlying technology.
Boo.
Right? I think like both of you guys were in the framework camp. But let's just play the game anyways. Who wants to give me a guess as to what they think the percentage was? Let's start with you, Alan. Which one do you think won, and what, give me a number.
I feel like you're all over there, all giddy to kill this one. So I'm going to say that you won with the language 60-40.
60% underlying and
Yeah.
40%
Yeah.
on the framework side.
Although I think that's crazy talk.
Okay. What about what about you, Joe?
Well,
What do you
since it's
think?
a coding podcast, I'm going to say that we cater to and have more voters that are kind of engineering minded. So I will say that only 60% got it correct, and the other 40 chose to run before you can walk. Or walk
Yeah, but
before you
what's
can
your
run.
60% then?
It's the framework one, of course.
So okay. So you guys, just to make sure we're on the same page, Joe is saying 60% voted for frameworks, and Alan is saying 60% voted for underlying technologies.
Yes.
All right. Well, here's the answer: 64.2% voted for frameworks.
Yoo-hoo!
I'll dive into the underlying as needed.
Yeah, baby.
That means that only just under 36% of our audience is correct. And that it's the underlying technologies.
Well, see, here's the thing. People that go learn languages just want to learn things. People that go use frameworks want to get things done.
So I thought that when you were mentioning Julie Lerman earlier, I thought that this was like a segue that you were going to use to mention this one, because you were talking about her diving into new technologies and stepping through the debugger and whatnot. But I still, that's just...
I'm glad
Yes.
that I was wrong about what the percentages were, because I feel like now I have a great respect for our audience that we're starting to learn about through our surveys.
So I will say this. I still say I was right. But so maybe I'll say two things. And the second one being that, a friend had mentioned, well, because he kind of put some context around it. Like if you're doing this for if this is on the job training, right? Like you gotta get something accomplished, right? Then, diving into the frameworks is, what you're going to do. And it's kind of like, okay, fine. I'll take that answer, given that context. Because I was thinking of it more like, hey, I would like to learn, whatever, right? Like Angular. You're not going to jump into Angular if you don't already have some JavaScript experience, right? You're going to need to know some JavaScript before you jump into
I disagree.
Angular.
You go look at a tutorial.
Oh my God. I'm telling you my frame of mind. You can't disagree with what my frame of mind was at the time. I'm telling you where I was coming from, the place that I was in, and I still say that I was right. In 36% of our audience, I'm rounding that up, is with me and also correct in that you gotta walk before you run there with the underlying technologies. So crazy people.
Yep. I'm glad that everybody made the right decision, or most everybody.
Well, speaking of polls, we didn't come up with one for this episode, so I guess you're just going to have to head to /episode 31 to find out what it is.
Yeah, this one's going to be a surprise, and I'm putting this one together, so I have no idea what it's going to be.
Well, you mentioned I corrected you on the OS X earlier, because that's also been one that's come up before.
A few
where,
times.
just recently too. It was one of the Microsoft presentations that they did. Maybe it was build related. I don't forget when. And maybe it was for the OS 10 or Windows 10 announcement. And they kept referring to it as OS X, and I'm like, it's OS 10. OS 10. It's even, you could go to the Wikipedia page. It's OS 10. Apple doesn't call it OS X.
Why wouldn't they just write the number 10 then? Are they too cool? Are they a Roman company? Were they born in Greece or Rome? Or
This is just good marketing right here. That's what that is. Because previously, previously they did write the numbers.
See?
Until it got to 10, and then they switched to the Roman
They
numeral.
said X looks cooler.
It do, and you got to give them credit. It does.
Yeah, whatever. It's OS X. All right,
Whatever.
all right.
OS 10. Maybe that should be the survey. How do you pronounce it? Is it OS X or OS 10?
I don't know. I might do that
Because Wikipedia is on my side.
If I can't come up with anything relevant to do a survey about, then I will do that one for sure.
Wikipedia. I'm just saying.
All right, so
Look it
now
up.
it is now time to jump into this particular episode's meat and potatoes.
I promise.
Yes, he promises.
It's OS 10.
So what we're talking about today is JavaScript promises. And before we get into a ton of it, I just first I want to say, like, this is a fairly big deal. I think it's planned on being baked into ES or ECMAScript 6. And here's the deal. There are a ton of libraries out there that deal with this kind of stuff. There's Bluebird, ES6, Promise Polyfill, jQuery, which is not strictly to the standard Q, or it's KEW.
And that one.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And then
Which
there's,
is, suspiciously pronounced like the Q library.
yeah. And then there's Lie. There's the Q library, which is the letter Q, and Angular actually uses a smaller version of that. And then there's RSVP. Now, of all these, RSVP, I think, actually, no, it's the ES6 Promise Polyfill one. That is basically a subset of the RSVP that very closely resembles the ECMA6 specs. So that's kind of what we took for this particular episode. But here's the cool thing, right? Like, you used to back in the day when you talk about a JavaScript. Go
We
ahead.
should also clear up too. You keep calling it ECMA6, but they've changed the name now to 2015.
Okay, whatever.
So just saying.
All right, so here's one of the things, like, you know, maybe just even a couple years ago, if we were talking about JavaScript promises or anything JavaScript, typically you're thinking about front end type code, right? So just keep in mind when we're talking about this now, we're talking about it could be server side, it could be client side. You know, if it's a node type thing, then that could be server side. If it was, you know, any one of these 5,000 JavaScript framework libraries out there, then it could be client side. But these things, a lot of these libraries can actually be included server side or client side. So just something to be aware of. And so I guess first, what the heck is it,
Trying
right?
to sum that up as isomorphic.
It is isomorphic. You can have the same language both server and client side, right? Now, so what is a promise? Why does it matter, right?
I have two one-word answers to those two questions.
Okay.
And they're not very good answers, but I want to say them anyway. So, what our promise is, then.
That's pretty good.
And oh crap! And my second answer is not. It's not one word. But why do they matter? My answer is 1 inch, because that's about how much screen share it saves you.
Interesting take on it. That's not true.
I had a different answer, and that was that it tries to solve the callback hell problem by introducing callback hell.
Yeah. So I've actually heard of other people. I've heard other people refer to it as the pyramid of the pyramid of callback doom or something, right?
I like that.
Yeah, because as you get your callbacks, your code just literally starts, like to what Joe said, starts incrementing like an inch. So what he said was an inch could turn into 30 fairly quick. But so to get back to the serious thing is, promises have a thenable approach, so that if you have an async request, basically instead of having a callback that has a bunch of logic in it, you just say .then. Hey, when this async request is finished, then run this. Otherwise, if there was an error, do this. So the really interesting part about this is, if you've worked with any asynchronous JavaScript before, the way that you would typically do things is, let's say that you had 3 async calls. and each one of them depended on the previous one, you would basically have async call 1 with a callback, and then inside that, you would basically have an async call 2, then with a callback that's now indented over some more, and then an async 3 with its own callback. Now, there are some pitfalls to this. We just mentioned one, which is just your code becomes unwieldy, right? Like there's so much nested code that to follow it is fairly disgusting.
I mean, to answer your question in seriousness though about what they are, why they matter, I would put that in as that they provide a usefulness for async programming though. I mean that.
Yes, that's what it's for.
That'd be a much better way to sum that up as to like what they're doing.
So
yeah, and actually,
or why you might want them.
Yeah, and I also want to mention one of my favorite things about it is that it bubbles up exceptions really nicely.
Yes.
Which is something that callbacks have a real big problem with. If, a problem happens in one of them, then you've got to kind of funnel the scrap out. But with the dot then dot fail syntax, then if any one of those fail, it just kind of gets bubbled up like normal synchronous exception handling.
Yeah, it's like wrapping a huge try-catch around all your async calls, as opposed to when you have the nested callbacks, you have to handle it on each level.
That was another thing that I actually wrote in my notes about like when I was describing promises to myself, is that it's like try-catch on crack.
That's what it is. It's very, yeah, I mean.
But it's like, because, okay, so let's take an example, right? Like, if you were going to read some image off of a remote server, right, and you wanted to do it safely, right, you might do that inside of a try and then have a catch handler for it, right? And this is where Alan's .then.fail comes in, because with a promise, right, you could have the .then.
It's actually not dot fail though.
Well, okay,
it's dot then comma and then the failure.
Right.
So, yes.
Right. Okay. But right, if you were going to could you pass in like a success and a fulfill and a reject method, right?
Yep.
Or a callback. And one of them can handle the success portion of it, which would be in your try, and the other portion could handle if there's a failure, which is your catch portion. But then you start chaining these things together, then, and that's when I was thinking like of this as being on crack, because the alternative would be nested tries.
Yes.
Which could get, going back to your pyramid scheme, right, of try catches would be crazy.
Yeah, it can get really ugly. And one of the interesting things is, and we have an article we're going to link to in the show notes because it's one of the best I saw when we were looking at this. But like the approach they took was, let's say that you have a book, right? And then that book has chapters, and then those chapters have content. So as you're doing this, so you're going to load your book first, because that's one async call. Now you're going to load your chapter list. That's another async call. Then you're going to load the content of those chapters. That's another async call. Well, the problem is, like in the past, like I said, you would typically just start nesting these callbacks. After the first one finishes, all right, now do a callback and run the next async request.
Here's an event listener for this section.
Yeah, and it just keeps growing. So like, let's say that at that point, let's say that if you wanted to take it even a step further, that'd be crazier. And instead of loading all the content for that chapter, say maybe you load 3 pages at a time so that you didn't get a huge chapter that blew everything out. Now you're going to have even more nested. The promises allow you to say load chapter or load book dot then, load chapter dot then, load content dot then, load pages, whatever. And then at the end of all that, if you wanted to, you could put off your catch and say dot catch and then put your error handling in there. And if any one of those previous async calls failed, it would all get handled in that catch, and then it would all basically have a fail, right? And then you can figure out what you want to do from there.
Yep. And what's funny to me is that looking at this, it's really discernible. Like when you see then, you're dealing with promises. But what's really funny to me is it really does make this asynchronous code look synchronous. It looks like you're blocking on a thread, like prompt the user. When that's done, run the web service. When that's done, populate the UI with the response. And so it's really masking over a lot of complexity. But what's funny is it really is kind of simplifying things and making it act like you're just dealing with a synchronous program.
So let's ask the question then, why is it so hot now?
I think because JavaScript has gotten to the point where it's so pervasive in everything, right? Like back in the day, before all these frameworks got really hot, you know, there were a handful of us out there using Ajax calls and all that, and you just dealt with what you did because single page applications weren't all the norm back then, right? Like you might have one or two calls on a page. Nowadays, like everything on your page is asynchronously grabbed, right? Like you only get the data that you need. And so now it's a big deal. And so I think that's probably what it is. That'd be my guess. And then also now you're not just doing it client side. Now you're doing it server side. And when you have a bunch of server side code, like think about database inserts, right? Like let's just take that for example. If you are sending up a bunch of data that has to insert a person and then insert their favorite books and then insert, different sections, you all have all these, after this happens, then do this, then do this, then do this. And it becomes really a pain to read and track. So
yeah, I totally agree with you. I really think this is all Node's fault, why it's so popular. Because the deal is, we've got all this really cool non-blocking async stuff going on in the server. But that's not going to work for me. I need to get the stuff from the database. I need to do some stuff with it, and then I need to return it. And so I think people were working a lot more with Node, and they're doing this stuff with callbacks, which is just a nightmare.
Node. I thought he said notes.
Node.
And I was like, wait a minute, like Lotus Notes?
Node.js.
You're blaming. You're giving Lotus Notes credit for JavaScript promises
or for anything.
So I actually have a little chain here in my notes where basically why are promises in JS such a big deal? And it's because of callbacks. So why do we even have callbacks in JavaScript? And basically, I think it's because there's such a asynchronous heavy UI model. That's where the language came from. So.
Yeah, and I think we might have put this further down. I can't even remember how we have this organized right now. But one of the things to note, and I don't think we wrote this anywhere, is when you do these promises, it's deferreds that you're dealing with. So so the thing is, when you have a .then, it's returning something back.
I don't want to get confused with let's not call it deferreds, if you don't mind, because what I don't want to get confused with specifically is jQuery's implementation, because jQuery
is different.
Is not the standard ECMA.
But promises actually have deferred.
2015.
It is deferred. It's called the same thing.
But there's also a lot of the documentation you're going to read just talk about it as an eventual result.
And so that's the key is what I wanted to get at. So what you see, what Joe mentioned a minute ago, where it all looks like it's truly synchronous, what's happening is you are returning back what is called literally a promise that it's going to either be fulfilled, rejected. That's pretty much it, right?
No, there's
or it could be abandoned.
4 states. There's fulfilled, rejected, pending, and settled.
Okay,
right, are the states. So before we get into some of that, the implementation gory details of it, though, let me just say with we got a lot of love from you guys in reviews in the last after the last episode, and we really, really appreciate that. And if you're new to listening to the show and you haven't already put up a review on either Stitcher or iTunes or Reddit or wherever, we would greatly appreciate it if you would take the time and put that review out there. We really appreciate it. It goes a long way to help us out in new people finding us, and we really do appreciate it. And tell a friend, share their friend, share the show with a friend or 14, Pick your number of choice. So, I just threw out 14. I think that's a good recommendation.
And speaking of helping us out, this episode is sponsored by Infragistics. Great apps happen by design. Build your application right from the start with rapid prototyping, UI controls, and the support you need to develop the ultimate experience. So head over to Infragistics.com and download your free trial.
All right, so now we can get into the implementation details.
Let's do it.
So we mentioned the 4 states of it, but what we haven't really said here that I think is one very key thing, that when when I jokingly referred to it as callback hell or try catch on crack, one huge difference, why you should care about promises, is that they do have state. right? Because that's huge. So
Right.
I mentioned that there's four states: fulfilled, rejected, pending, and settled, right? Now, if a promise has already been fulfilled or rejected, no matter how or when you call it again later, it's going to give back the same result,
Right.
right? It's not re-executing that code. It's just returning back the same value that it returned back the first time, right? Which is a huge difference.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, that's major. What were you waiting for me to
Well, I was.
I wish I took a screenshot of your face. Like you were looking at me like, like, what do you think about that, huh? I don't know.
No, I mean that's absolutely true, because in a callback you'd basically re-execute it, right? With this, because of what he said right there, if you try and execute it again, quote unquote, it's not going to do anything. It's just going to give you back what you already had. So yeah, that's a big differentiator right there. But you said there was another piece, right? As far as the state, like, or was that pretty much where you're going with that one?
No, I thought I pretty much covered.
Okay,
There was the
yeah.
four pieces,
Yeah.
the four states that it could be in. Is that what you mean?
No, so I guess so. Where I was going with this earlier, to stack on top of that, because I wasn't even going to say that, was the fact that when you have these things that look all synchronous, they look synchronous, but really what's happening is it blew through all that code. Now you basically have a bunch of things that are in some sort of probably pending state until it comes back and is either accepted or rejected. And here's the cool thing. So when you chain together these then, what you're returning back is you're returning back a promise from each one of those things. So basically this is promise.then. That now is the promise that the next .then is going to rely on. And those don't actually do anything until the state changes on it to resolved or settled, where it was either rejected or, fulfilled or accepted? I can't remember.
Fulfilled, rejected, pending, settled.
Okay, so fulfilled. So once that happens, then it says, all right, let me look at the next thenable function that's there and let me run that. Now, one thing that we kind of glossed over a little while ago that is kind of an interesting piece of this is when you have a .then, and let's just say you have a then your function, a then a function, then function, and then .catch. Basically what's going to happen is any one of those three async calls that led up to that .catch, any one of those fails, it's going to skip the rest of those .thens and go straight to the catch, and then you're going to handle that error. Now, another way you can handle it is every thenable function, you can also pass in a function to handle the rejection. So you can have .then, your function, typically an anonymous function. I mean, you see that a lot. You could pass in anything. But if you have comma and then another function, that is an error handling function. Now, the interesting part about this is when you have an async .then and then comma else really for the error, only one of those two gets called. If that async function failed before the then only the error function is called. If the async function succeeded, then the then's called and the error function is never called. It skips it. However, if you do this with the catch, the success function may still run before the .catch hits. It's really kind of weird how it all works out. And again, in the show notes, we are going to put a link up to this other thing where the guy actually has a nice flow diagram that, will probably take you 20 minutes to read through.
Oh, there were several. There's going to be a bunch of links in the resources that we liked for this episode, because when I was doing some research on this, there was one of the articles that I read, the author basically took the approach of, what if you had to create promises? How would you create it? Right.
Nice.
And he starts walking it down like, here's what would be required. Right. And here's the next thing that'd be required. And then there was another one that was just one of the presentations that was given at the JS Conf in Europe, and he gave a great overview of the of promises, going from like, well, why is this a thing? So like, there's going to be some awesome links that we'll include in that. But
Very cool. So here's another thing about promises that I really like. And this is something that I've dealt with for years in callbacks. It's a little frustrating. So let's say that you have a page that you can't display anything on until 3 requests finish, right? The way that you would typically handle this back in the days of callbacks is you'd have some sort of variable that a function would manage that was basically a counter to say, okay, how many of these succeeded? I have these 3 methods, right? When callback 1 hits and that's done, then I'm going to increment the counter. When the counter gets to 3, everything's good. All right, let me continue on my way, right?
is that a global variable counter?
No, it would be encapsulated.
Is that a singleton counter?
No. It could be a singleton. I don't think I would use a global. But
Hey, why you got to say the old days? I did this like last week.
actually, you know what's funny about that? You're true. Depending on the type of library you're using, if they're not using promises and all they have are callbacks, you're pretty much stuck unless you bring in a third-party promise library where you can handle this kind of thing. But I digress. Now, what's really cool with promises, though, they have this thing to where you can parallelize a number of calls so that, hey, my 3 calls, you can basically just say, hey, do this. And I think it's, what is it, promise.all? Where is it?
Yeah,
I think it's
dot
just
all.
all.
Yeah, dot all. And that's absolutely amazing. So if you have 20 things that have to complete before you move on about your way, you say, promises dot all. Once this is done, then do this next thing. And you don't have to try and stitch these things together yourself, right? That's amazing. I love that.
One thing that I failed to mention, though, when I mentioned the different states of it and the fact that it's awesome that it's, that because these promises have state, and if you were to try to call that value later or multiple times, and you're going to get the same thing. What I didn't mention when I was describing that is that that's immutable.
Yeah.
So
And actually,
that state that value and state aren't going to change.
which is good and bad. Some of the cons actually for promises that I was reading about is that it's not so good for recurring type tasks. Like if you're doing some sort of polling or streaming, then because it's immutable, you have to be doing this kind of weird, creating of promises and have a little promise factory shooting these things off and collecting them.
Huh. Yeah, that's true. Because otherwise you get the same result back every time. Yeah, that's...
Yep. And some other negatives I saw were that basically this new spec, even though some of the libraries have support for it, but the new spec ES 16 or 20 or 2015 or 6, sorry, there's no way to cancel it. And there's no sort of like progress indicator. Like, so if you knew how long a task is going to take, there's no sort of support in the language spec to be able to say like, hey, how far along am I?
Interesting.
Yeah, not the end of the world.
No, but I mean, it's important when you're thinking about, using these things to build your next application. That's definitely something valid to think about.
Yeah, I mean, going back to that video from the JSConf in it was the 2013 JSConf Europe presentation, and it was man, I hope I don't butcher this name, but Forbes Lindsay that gave the presentation, but he gave what I thought were 4 really awesome values of promises in that presentation that were why these are a thing, why you should care to try out promises if you haven't already, right? And one is that it works with the primitive control flow, right? Or the control flow primitives, right? You don't have to do anything there to make that happen. You can already work with it, right? So you have some, you want to use it in a for each loop, and it can do it on its own, right? And it can handle the errors or let them bubble up properly, right? That was one example that Joe already mentioned. One of the things that he liked about it. And then it doesn't conflate the input with the output, right? When you're dealing with your promises, right? Your code is really clean, and it's keeping, like, one thing that I really kind of thought about this was if we go back to solid, right? Or even if you have any familiarity or experience with doing aspect-oriented programming, that's kind of what promises felt like to me too, was that it was keeping the business logic of your methods more clean, right?
Yeah.
You're not dealing with a lot of try-catch kind of boilerplate crap, right? You have a method that's your error handler. You have a method that's your business logic, and your promise allows you to keep those two clean, right? And then the fourth value that he pointed out in this presentation was that your code looks like async code.
Yeah.
For someone who has never seen this code, has no idea what the app does, and they just walk up to it, they can immediately look at this code and say, oh, yeah, that looks like asynchronous code, just because of all the .thens that might be chained together. And I think Joe mentioned that too as like one of the things that he liked about it.
So what about other languages? Did a little bit of research. Because usually when you hear the word promises, the person's usually talking about JavaScript, that or maybe C++ because they're getting some support for that soon. But actually, most languages I looked at had something that took the place of it. C# had tasks. Java had... They've got features and promises kind of coming along in more recent versions, although you're able to do stuff like that in Scala or just kind of build it in yourself for a long time. C++, Python, pretty much everyone's got support for it. But a lot of times these other languages have things like built in or just slightly different from JavaScript. Like I'm more familiar with .NET, so I'm used to it having things like cancellation built in, and it's kind of cool. It like actually returns what they call a task. So you can start the task now, you can start it later, you can, serialize, reserialize, and then start it. You can do all sorts of weird stuff with it. That's kind of cool, and it works with generics, which I really like. And what's also interesting about the task is that it's actually built into the library for C# or the .NET framework. And so promise is more of a convention. Depending on the framework you're using, you're going to do some Googling to figure out exactly how they work. And I like with tasks, like it's literally,
well,
the
until
task
you're
object.
using ES6 there, right? Because then it's in this ES6 specification.
Yeah, whenever that is supported by IE8, just let me know.
Right.
Well, that's why you use a polyfill or one of these other libraries, right?
I'm not doing any of that.
Yeah,
and for
it's
those
not
of
looking
you,
good for ES6 for IE8.
anybody that's heard the word polyfill and has no idea what they're talking about, there's basically tons of little libraries out there written to fill in the gaps of things like IE8 or these older browsers that keep hanging around for whatever reason. So that's what a polyfill is.
Yep.
When we were talking about other libraries, though, that this was included in, one that you left off there was EXTJS.
Well, that's in the newest version, right?
Version 6, it is ES6. It complies to the ES6 spec. So,
oh, interesting. Yeah, the thing that's kind of crazy about that, and I'll never understand why the powers that be only include certain things. So, like RSVP is one of the more popular.
that and Q are really popular.
Yeah, and they left off some of the functionality that those libraries add to the table, and it's like, well, why didn't you just implement?
Wait, who's they?
The ECMA 6 board that decides what goes in there.
The standards body.
Yeah, the standards body. Like, I don't understand why they're like, yeah, that one just doesn't really matter as much. You know what I'm saying? Like, why not take the ones that people have decided that they really like and need and just say, hey, this is it. It's not like it's that more difficult for these browsers to keep up with them. So,
well, I guess this is what happens when you're like, decision by committee.
Yeah,
that's a good point. Somebody's like, yeah,
we
I don't
should
need
start
that.
a committee for something.
Yeah.
But, as you were talking about promises in other languages, though, like, you mentioned tasks in C#, and I guess that's kind of not really close.
Totally.
Maybe kind of close.
Absolutely.
I mean, it really, there really is some awesomeness to it, though, that, like I said, the fact that it does have that aspect type kind of feel to it, right? Where it's like really keeping the business logic of your methods clean. I really appreciate.
Yeah, and that is something that you miss out with on C#. Like, the syntax doesn't, it doesn't look as pretty as the promises do in JavaScript for a variety of reasons, but it's not terrible, and for a static language, it's about what I expect, but promises in JavaScript is really beautiful. And I think a lot of times that's why when people talk about promises, they talk about JavaScript. It just works really nicely with the first class functions and also closures. It just works really well in that environment.
Now, you heard it here, right?
Yeah.
Joe just referred to something about JavaScript as beautiful.
I know.
Right?
I think
Beautiful.
he's sick.
The weather down there must be getting to him. I think he's got like too much sun. Are you wearing a hat or some sunscreen?
No, I had a hair incident, and now my head is really shiny, and it's hurting my eyes and giving me a headache and making me think that I like JavaScript.
You want to know one of the frustrating things? When I was doing this, like I actually spent some time. I was going to put together some cool examples. And I was like, you know what? It would be cool to make something that's not just a contrived example, right? Like, what if I go pull from Amazon or, maybe get a list of things and then get some reviews. And then I was like, man, this is really a pain in the butt because now I got to generate some keys. I got to set up a bunch of server-side garbage
if you want
to do this.
anything AWS.
Yeah, AWS is like, and I very much appreciate it.
That's why you should use JAWS.
Yeah, this is a real library.
The JavaScript for AWS library.
Oh man, but so here's the thing, right? Like, so you start looking at some of their examples. They're like, well, here's a tool, a utility to generate some keys. But here's the problem, people. You can't expose any of that stuff client side because then everybody's going to steal your information anyways. So you have to, like, everything I looked at that I was like, well, I could do this example. And then I'm like, well, I got to go set up some keys and some OAuth things and some private and some shared. And then it's like, oh God, now I got to do a full blown implementation. And it just wears you down. So, I really wanted to put together some nice, real life type stuff, but it is actually fairly involved. Like you start getting into writing an app when you just try to demonstrate this. And that's why almost every article you see out there is say, hey, imagine you have this book, right? And then imagine you have these chapters. And that's why everything is like that because it's frustrating.
Just in case if anyone should be, some curiosity should be sparked about that JAWS comment that I made. It's the JAWS stack. So if you were to go to github.com/JAWS-stack/JAWS, you can find it there.
Yep.
The serverless stack.
It's so, man, everything requires a server. And I was like, you know what? I can do it in Node. But then it's like, man, I don't want to set up a Node and do all that. Because then I'm going to have to decide whether I want to use Express.js or whether I want to try to do it in Meteor. Or maybe this is the kind of stuff that runs through my head every time I go to do like a little tiny project like that. And it's like, and then by the end of it, you're just worn out thinking about it. And then you're like, I can't code anything.
Yep. So keep things simple and use globals.
I think that was the answer. That right there is the answer.
Well, I mean, he mentioned a global counter, so I feel like that's fair.
Yeah.
Boom.
I think he needs to go back and change his answer from above.
All right. Awesome. So that's about it for this topic. So to recap really quickly, promises provide really nice quote then unquote syntax that provides simple looking syntax for asynchronous code. And it handles exceptions very nicely, and that's a big deal for JavaScript because async programming, I didn't say sucks. It just is, and because JavaScript is winning at everything.
But I gotta say though, this is completely off topic for promises. Async programming is a little bit hard to just talk about or wrap your head around. I guess from an implementation standpoint, because we've talked about doing an episode on it, right? And we probably will eventually. But one of the things that I just really love about it is you can get so much more out of doing something asynchronously. Like, I remember taking a problem that we had where something was taking hours to do, and I reduced it to like 2 minutes using async programming, right?
All right.
And there's very little in what we do that is as exciting as getting like 20,000% returns on your effort. So
It'll definitely make you giddy if you've never done it before, and then all of a sudden you start paralyzing some stuff.
Yeah, and then you're like, oh man, and then you start trying to paralyze everything, and that's a problem.
So I mentioned earlier that there was going to be like a ton of resources that we like links in here, and just looking at our list here collectively between the three of us, there's maybe 11 or so different links. So here's the deal: in our show notes, we're going to include all of this, and it's going to be a lot of information. But you can also, from within your podcast app, you can view these show notes. I know within the iOS app, you just simply quote album art for the episode within the iOS podcast player, and then that'll flip over to the show's metadata, and you can see all the show notes there. Other podcast players have similar type functionality, like on Android, for example, to get to all that. So these links are going to be available for you whether you're at your computer visiting codingblocks.net, or if you're just simply browsing around or listening on your phone and want to browse around while you listen. That information will be available.
And if they're not clickable, you need a different podcast app.
Wow.
Just saying.
Ouch.
All right.
They're clickable on iOS.
They're clickable in Pocket Cast as well, which is what I use on Android, and I love that app. So now it's time for our tips of the week.
Yeah, definitely week.
All right. So, man, I stumbled across this recently. I just thought it was so cool. So, back in the day, if you had a bunch of XML and you wanted to turn this into C# classes, what you would do is there was like this xsd.exe or something that you could download, and it would, churn through your XML and spit out these C# classes. You no longer need a third-party utility. If you are on Visual Studio 13, or probably above, I know for certain this works in 2013. If you go to
you didn't try this in older versions?
No, I didn't.
Okay, sorry.
It might be in 2012 as well. I think it is. I think that's where I first saw it.
Let's just say that you should try this regardless of what version you're in, and let us know if it doesn't work in your version.
Yeah, so either XML or JSON, take either one, copy it, go into Visual Studio, go to your edit menu, and go down to Paste Special, and there will be two options there. One for paste XML as classes or paste JSON as classes. And what you will get is so beautiful. It will actually inspect either your JSON or your XML, and it will create a C# class with all the serializable tags and everything on it already, so that you can quickly take some output from something and map it to an object. And it is absolutely phenomenal. It works well. So didn't know that existed. I would definitely try that out, if nothing else, just for fun, even if you don't need it. It's just so cool.
I'm really surprised you didn't mention WebStorm as your tip of the week.
That's coming. I have too many tips.
All right. All right. So, I love Git, right? We've kind of gone over this one before.
It wasn't Subversion?
Surprisingly, it wasn't. So here's another Git tip for you. Let's say the scenario is that you committed something, okay, and you know what you want to search for, right? But you don't know how. And when I say that you want to search for, I don't mean that you want to search your commit message, the message log, or the log for what the commit message was. You want to actually search the content of the commits, right? So some file has some, text in it, foobar, that you want to go searching for, right? So let's say that you want to search for foobar from those files. You could say git space grep space -e space, and then in single quotes, whatever text you want to search for, space $, and then in parentheses, git space rev-list space -- and then space -- max count dash, I'm sorry, I meant max dash count, and then let's say equal 500, right? So that's the end of your parentheses there.
And you have to memorize this. There will be a test.
Right, there's going to be
later.
a test.
Yeah, this will not be in the show notes. You are
What?
screwed.
Why would you do that?
Replay it until you
That's
got
so
it.
wrong. So again, what this is doing here, right? The first portion of this is doing a grep, and then you're specifying some text here, and you're using the -e is going to be necessary for strings that might begin with a dash, right? So it's just safe. It's not going to hurt anything if you added it for other strings, but it's definitely going to help you for strings that do begin with a dash. You're going to need that in there. And then the quoting the string isn't technically necessary, but it's definitely a good practice to go ahead and do. And especially these are, going to be handy if you're going to bake this into a script that you might use for some other purpose, right? And then, then the next thing we did was inside of that, there was another command that we did, which was the get rev list, dash all dash max count. And technically the dash max count isn't necessary. However, if you have, if your rev list is too long, right? If that's going to return back too many, then what's going to happen is you'll get back an error that'll say argument list too long. And so, or you might get an error that says bad file number. It'll be one of those two. And that's why if you go ahead and just specify your max count, it'll, help you out if to limit that list of commits that you're going to go back and search content through, right? But it'll return back every commit that has that text in it, where that pattern is found, right? And that might be depending on whatever, how, if you're not specific enough, it might return back a lot. But if you're using from command line within, let's say the get command line within OS 10, right? It'll go ahead and highlight in a different color, like mine's doing it in red, the pattern, showing you this is the pattern that I found in this commit. So it'll give you back the commit ID, where it found it, and then the file that it found it, and then the actual string of text that was matched. So I thought that was a really helpful command that I've used in the past when I was looking for a very specific, I know that this used to have this particular class name or string or whatever it was that I was searching for. Where is that?
So you're actually searching the changed code.
Yes, you're actually searching the contents of the commit, not the message of the commit.
Commit messages are basically worthless, right?
Well, no, I wouldn't say commit messages were worthless. And by the way, that's actually a pretty good one too, making your commit messages good, because who was it that sent us the tag cloud for Git? Techies
Was
UK?
it Andy? Yeah, that's Andy.
Yeah, it was Andy.
Yeah, it sent us the. We already tweeted it, but we can include that again in the show notes. A link to that, where he was making his commit messages. He was basically, how would you say that? He was structuring his commit messages into a particular format, right? To where one portion of the format was specifying, how risky this change was.
Yeah.
One was specifying what particular ticket or storyline is this part of, and I forget what the other part of the structure was. But basically, then he had a tag cloud plugin that he was using that would visualize, and you could see here's all the commits that might be for a particular story or ticket. Here's all the commits that we deem risky, right? It was a very interesting use of your commit messages. But the what I was talking about was not searching your commit messages. It's actually searching the contents of the commit, the code.
Yeah, I was just kidding. I was just imagining trying to look for something and looking through all these messages Friday 5 o'clock or whatever,
All right, that brings us to you, Joe.
Yes. All right. So heard from Brett at wewet.com, and he's got a really cool business where you can buy website themes, but they're specific to .NET, right? So rather than buying a theme off, say ThemeForest or something, and then taking it and trying to kind of get that into a MVC project or whatever, you buy these and they're already set up for you. So you just download and then double click the solution and go. So I am all about lowering the bar to innovation and getting stuff done. So that's really nice. So wewet.com, WIWET.com.
Yeah, and they integrate so nicely into Visual Studio. I don't know if you've already seen this. If you played around with it, you basically install it it was a NuGet package, but then from within, if you go to within Visual Studio, do File New Project, right, it would show up as one of the available, canned kind of packages that you create, and it would go ahead and stub everything out for you.
Hey Joe,
it's really nice.
I think you meant lowering the barrier to innovation, not lower
What
the
is that?
bar.
Lower the bar? Oh man, it's getting late.
When you said that, I was like, well, that's interesting. Let's make all our apps suck more. I'm all for it.
How did I miss that?
Lowering the innovation bar.
Yeah, dude, I love that. That's actually what our tagline should be.
No, God, no.
Yeah, we want T-shirts that say that. That's what I need.
Oh, that was awesome.
Oh, man.
Yeah. So we also wanted to throw in one from Matthew Watkins, who sent us an email, and this one's kind of cool. It's there is an open source program called Autohotkey that you can basically map hotkeys on your keyboard, and I don't know if he was clear whether or not it was Windows or Mac or what, but so basically he's got something crazy like, he does something in Visual Studio and he wants to commit that change. The way that Outlaw and I operate is we would then switch over to a command window. We would do a get status. We would, there's this whole string of things to get that commit. Well, he got tired of doing that. So he mapped this hotkey to where basically he hits this thing, it automatically switches over to his bash terminal. It automatically runs the commands to actually do this commit. So it's literally almost like a macro runner for your hotkeys.
You know what this reminded me of when we read this was, I forget who mentioned it. Maybe Joe will remember, because this came up before, where someone was using a gaming mouse that had all the programmable buttons on it. And they were programming the functions of the gaming mouse so that they could just click that one button and it would do, whatever the action
ridiculous
was. So
macros.
like, builds in Visual Studio or, I don't know, whatever.
Yeah, it's very much like that. And I mean, it's pretty cool, right? Like,
so this was a different version of that, except without the hardware requirement.
Yep, this is just software that you can download and use. Just map it to whatever. Oh, he is using Windows, so he said currently he's using Windows key plus G. So, yeah, I mean, pretty cool stuff. I've not used it yet, but it's something I will probably check out. And it is open source, and it's out there, so you can go grab it. We'll have a link in the show notes for that as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, so, just wrapping up the show, I promise we discussed promises.
And we did.
And, subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, and more using your favorite podcast app. Be sure to give us a review on iTunes, Stitcher. We really appreciate it. Throw some love out on Reddit, too, or Stack Overflow. We really do enjoy finding that and really appreciate it when we see it.
Or heart us on SoundCloud. I think that's what it is. So, yeah, we have all these places.
Of all the ones you picked.
Right, so
good thing it was a heart.
So also contact us with a question or topic. Leave your name, preferred method of shout out, whether that's website, Twitter, whatever. We'll mention you on the podcast. Definitely go visit us at www.codingblocks.net, where you can find show notes, examples, discussions, and more.
And you can send us your feedback, questions, and rants to comments at codingblocks.net. And make sure to visit us on Twitter at codingblocks, or check out Facebook/codingblocks. It's blowing up on Facebook lately. It's crazy. It's wild. Check it out.
Yeah.
It's like 100 followers.
We've gone global.
100 followers.
That's awesome.
I'm going to go post there right now.